Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast of St. Louis on the Air, brought to you by University College at Washington University. With undergraduate and graduate programs, part-time, evening, and online. University College at Washington University, offering world-class education within reach.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Mars. Of all the things that St. Louis is known for, beer has to be at or near the top of the list. It has been a long and rich tradition of making the sudsy brew, and there is also history in the making as craft brewers are making their presence felt. In fact, the craft beer phenomenon is growing at such a rate that the third edition of a St. Louis beer history book is just out. It's titled St. Louis Brews, The History of Brewing in the Gateway City. It's compiled by Henry Herbst, Kevin Hughes, and Don Roussin, and Cameron Collins. Cameron Collins joins me in studio. Nice to see you again. Thanks for being with us.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Why a third edition?
Well, several reasons, and you've already mentioned one of them. The craft beer scene is thriving in St. Louis today. The first edition of the book contained 9 additional breweries other than Anheuser-Busch, of course. That was 10 years ago. The second book had about 16, and in this one we put more than 70. So we added all of those breweries. And also another reason is the second edition of the book burned in a big warehouse fire back in November that you may recall.
Reedy Press.
Reedy Press, yes, correct.
Yeah. So obviously you had to get some more books out. They've been selling very well too, haven't they?
They have, yeah.
What is St. Louis's fascination with beer?
Well, I believe it goes back to its rich German heritage, going back to the 1840s, where St. Louis turned into almost a German enclave overnight. And with them, they brought their customers who were thirsty for a new style of beer that we know as lager. And that gave rise to countless breweries where in the 1870s, Anheuser-Busch rose to the top of that heap. And although, except for a little hiccup with Anheuser-Busch InBev, we are still there. So,
what about the German fascination with beer? Do we know anything about that?
We really do, and it's a fascinating story, and we tell it in the book. About how St. Louis really, in American colonial times, ale was the type of beer that was preferred, table beer and small beer. And when the Germans came, they had this new style that was drank cold instead of warm. It was perfect for St. Louis with our caves underneath the city. And all the Germans in town just started drinking it like crazy.
The German tradition is such, I know a little bit about it, is that almost every town had its own brewery. And that kind of came true here, too. There were a lot of breweries early on, weren't there?
There really were, and they started off really as neighborhood operations where the beer you produced was probably distributed about as far as your horse could walk that day. And, they would make a couple barrels, and serve it to customers. That's how Johann Adam Lemp got his start. He made vinegar and beer in his grocery, and people started buying the beer, and he decided to become a brewer full time.
Well, I think most people think that Anheuser-Busch were the first kids on the block in this game, but that was far from the truth.
Far from the truth. And it really, they were, I even want to say that in the 1860s, they were probably, ranked lower than 20th in total output. It wasn't until Adolphus Busch arrived on the scene and really took Budweiser to the next step in the 1870s, when he just, everything from marketing and advertising to technological advancements, that he just, shot Budweiser, their flagship brand, to the top. But Yeah, you're right. The earlier brewers, guys like Joseph Uhrig and Julius Winkelmeyer, were the guys that established the foundation of brewing in St. Louis.
You refer often in the book to the glory days, and I guess Anheuser-Busch is so closely associated because that was right at the heart of the glory days of the beer industry.
It was, and we had St. Louis. We had, of course, we haven't even mentioned the Western Brewery, which was, of course, Lemp, who introduced Falstaff, and those two brands would come to dominate the 20th century, of course. But the glory days of St. Louis brewing in the 1880s and 1890s, you had these giant brewers in South St. Louis, but then you had substantial brewers like, Ellis Wainwright and the Stiefels and these just wonderful names that you come upon. And they, a couple times tried to consolidate and pool their resources to take on the big guys. And so you just had this city filled with breweries.
It must have been very competitive.
It really was. And that's exactly the smaller breweries attempted to consolidate twice to take on, but Budweiser or Anheuser-Busch and Lemp really were leading the charge, and they couldn't quite do it. And of course, Prohibition then plays a big role in all of that.
The Lemp name, of course, is still well known here in St. Louis, but I gather from what I've read of your book that he was really the kingpin for a good part of that middle of the 19th century.
Yeah, Adam Lemp is called the father of lager in St. Louis, and some people believe that he was the first to brew lager in the United States. And he was the first to utilize the caves beneath the city. And he was, and when his son, William Lemp, took over in 1862, they opened the big complex in South St. Louis that still stands today.
Might we say that he was more important to the beer industry in St. Louis than Anheuser-Busch?
I would say Adolphus Busch is a tough guy to top. Really? He was, and actually Eberhard Anheuser, who was Adolphus Busch's father-in-law, he was a soap and candle maker. He wasn't a brewer, but when his daughter Lily married Adolphus and they became 50-50 partners in the business, Adolphus really changed the game. But definitely the Lemps are a huge part of St. Louis brewing history.
Do we have any sense of what beer brewed at that time tasted like?
Yeah, actually, if you were to, it was in terms of the lager that was produced at the time, Anheuser-Busch and Lemp actually, part of the reason why their brands really took off is because they started producing a lighter, crisper lager that and also was more uniform from bottle to bottle. They started automating their processes and so forth. So if you opened a bottle of Budweiser, it would taste like a bottle of Budweiser before. The earlier brewers, it was a lot, maybe some of the smaller guys were even doing a lot of things by hand. They may have thrown in some ingredients and so forth if a batch didn't taste quite right. And it was darker and heavier than the crisper beers that Budweiser and Lemp started making.
Can we assume that each bottle tasted the same?
With Budweiser and
with individual brands.
Those brands, I believe you could, especially when they really started going into more advanced, when they started doing the pasteurization and they had their processes down pat. But the little guys on the street corners, I bet you it was a gamble every time you opened one of their bottles.
Of course, one of the big moments in this whole industry and the whole story is refrigeration. When that came in, it really changed the ballgame, didn't it?
It really changed everything. It allowed, basically artificial refrigeration allowed the brewers to brew their beer year round. They no longer had to use the caves I keep mentioning. Mm-hmm. And most importantly, it allowed for transportation. And Budweiser, Anheuser-Busch, and Lemp really took this to heart, and they could transport their products further distances by using refrigerated rail cars. After Budweiser was introduced and the refrigerated rail car was introduced, Budweiser had its beer in Colorado within a year.
Yeah.
So.
We know what Anheuser-Busch over the years has done in the way of marketing and how successful that's been. But when did the marketing that you mentioned earlier really get started?
In the 1880s. That's when the breweries really started trademarking their logos and their brand names and so forth. And that's where you start to see some legal issues arise for some brewers who were, like Joseph Uhrig started using the brand name Budweiser for one of his beers, and Anheuser-Busch went after him for that. And that's when you start to see uniformity with their labeling and so forth. That was right around the same time that a lot of those technological advancements were happening.
That Budweiser name has been kind of a nuisance ever since, hasn't it? Didn't they just go through this business with the Czech Republic town of Budweiser?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah.
Well,
let's move it along just a little bit. In terms of the marketing process, my understanding is that there was a period of time when, let's just say Anheuser-Busch, just to name one, they would have their own saloons all over town, and only their product was sold there. Tell me a little bit about that.
Right, and that's a fascinating part of the story is they would, saloons and taverns in St. Louis, Budweiser would pay for everything. They would pay for the bar, they'd pay for the furniture, but they had that saloon in return would exclusively sell that product. Recently, I gave a presentation on beer history at Pat Connolly Tavern on Oakland, He told me all about how the bar used to be a Griesedek Brothers bar, and then when it became a Budweiser bar, the Clydesdales brought the first shipment of Budweiser to the bar. So, and then, of course, fast forward to Prohibition, you had Anheuser-Busch opening establishments in town trying to promote beer as a family drink to try to separate it from the saloons and the distillers. And as a result, we still have some of those structures in St. Louis today with places like the Feasting Fox and the Bevo Mill, which is now known as Das Bevo.
Yeah. When did the Clydesdales come into the picture?
The Clydesdales came into the picture after Prohibition. So it was a part of their Budweiser's big promotion to, when beer is back, and the Clydesdales arrived to deliver the beer. So.
Didn't they, if I remember the story correctly, didn't Gussie Busch take the Clydesdales to Washington when the Prohibition was over?
I believe so. I know it is in the book, but he did. There's a great photo of him and two other Bushes shipping the very first case of Budweiser to them. I don't think he personally delivered it, but he had one on route as soon as that went through. So,
how did Anheuser-Busch survive Prohibition? I mean, that went on, 13 years or so?
It's a great story. They, Anheuser-Busch a couple other breweries, like they say, Falstaff, which was owned by Papa Joe Griesedek at the time, kind of did the same thing. But Budweiser sold soft drinks. They sold products such as malt Nutrine for expecting mothers. But really what I think really did it for them is they sold their own malt, and that allowed people to have an ingredient to make their own beer at home. So, but of course, Anheuser-Busch, they even made their own soft drinks. One was named Bevo, but they were the only brewery, although Falstaff did make it as well, but those are the only two that made it through.
Boy, and so we're talking how many that went under during that period of time, do you think?
I think the exact number, if I remember, is around 33 breweries closed in Prohibition, and 8 of them either reopened or new breweries opened when Prohibition was repealed. So. Why
do you think Anheuser-Busch was so successful? Was it just the marketing?
Marketing had a lot to do with it. I was reading actually. I was taking some notes on how, for example, Griesedek Brothers was a very popular brewery that came to be in the years after Prohibition. And I was reading this remarkable story how when the St. Louis Cardinals went up for sale in the 1950s, they were given first crack at the basically buying the team. And they decided not to, take that. And Anheuser-Busch jumped right in and said, we're going to buy the St. Louis Cardinals. All of a sudden, Harry Carey is no longer promoting Griesedek Brothers during games. He's promoting Budweiser. And they really just did a great job of also expanding the business throughout the United States by opening new breweries. While on the flip side, you had Falstaff, whose really process was buying failing breweries, and Anheuser-Busch was opening these new breweries with state-of-the-art equipment, and it was efficient.
You mentioned Harry Carey. There's a funny story that when he unceremoniously departed from the Cardinals team and he went up to Chicago, his first news conference had him drinking a Schlitz.
Right. He had a falling out with Anheuser-Busch, and I read that exact fact in the story I was reading yesterday.
I'm sure the boys on Pestalozzi really loved that.
Yeah.
We have a caller who wants to get into this conversation, so let's bring Jerry in. He's calling from O'Fallon. Jerry, thanks for being with us. You're on the air.
Well, good afternoon.
Hi.
Very few subjects I'd like to talk about more than beer. I just returned from Germany, and England, I'm not sure of possibly France, but a lot of countries over there, still have like vertical integration where a restaurant will be an Augustiner restaurant or a Hofbräu restaurant, and they will serve only that beer from that particular brewery. And same thing in England, where there are several varieties of beer at any pub you go into, but they all come. A pub is aligned vertically with a particular brewer, so you can't get, say, if London, you can get London's Pride if it's a Fuller house, but everyone else has their own different brand of bitters. So I thought that's kind of interesting, and also with Anheuser-Busch, I remember for years their slogan was "Making friends is our business," and I think their marketing, including the purchase of the Cardinals, and the fact that they have always made a point of talking about all the work that goes into their product. I remember reading somewhere that Budweiser was one of the most expensive beers to produce, and this was, written by someone who obviously knew like craft brew, and saying for something that is barely, distinguishable from what you'd call the, factory-type lagers, they put a lot of effort into it. And they also, make a consistent product even across several breweries across the country, which is not an easy thing to do.
Jerry, thank you for the call. He's obviously done his research.
Maybe you'll bring him aboard for the fourth edition.
For the fourth edition. Yeah. Well, let's talk about the craft brewers here in St. Louis. A very important part of the story. How many of them are there now?
Well, I did expand the footprint and worked with the St. Louis Brewers Guild, and so we actually I put every single brewery that was open. When I handed in my deadline or my manuscript on the deadline, I think I counted 72, and that's with about 100-mile radius of St. Louis. So I got Southern Illinois in there. I've even got Rolla in there, but they're all part of this big community, and there's so many creative brewers out there that are just doing these different, remarkable things with beer today.
Why do you think this is happening now?
Everybody loves craft beer these days. We have switched back from lager being the dominant style, 150 years ago, to ale now being the dominant. People are ordering IPAs and so forth, to the chagrin of some traditional beer drinkers. But there's just so much diversity happening, and But once again, we have some really larger brewers that are, you can order a Schlafly Pale Ale, and it's almost as common as finding a Budweiser today. But then there are guys like Side Project Brewing in Maplewood that are just pushing the boundaries and doing just really creative stuff.
I guess Tom Schlafly really got the ball rolling on that.
He did. In 1991, it was the first brewery to open in St. Louis in more than 50 years. And he got it all going.
How are the big boys reacting to this? Is it happening all over the country?
It is. I think, I haven't really researched that topic a whole lot. I think they are more accepting than, they're definitely aware that it's happening, and they're not. I really don't think they're putting up much of a fight against it and just trying to do their own thing.
Well, there is also a brewery, relatively new, a non-alcoholic beer. Mm-hmm. Is that really a beer?
Yeah, I think it is. Well,
it tastes a lot like it. Wellspring is the name of it. It's pretty darn
Well-being.
good. Well-being, yes,
yep.
I'm sorry.
And, I think so. They're in the Brewers Guild, so I put them in the book. And but I think that's a perfect example of, this guy, the head brewer, the owner, thought that there was a market because he loved the taste of beer, but he stopped drinking himself. And it's the best non-alcoholic beer I've ever had. It certainly beats O'Doul's. So
our time is running out, but he and his wife were on the show once, and they talked about going back to the German roots. They bought some equipment from Germany that gave them the opportunity to really match the taste of real beer in a non-alcoholic form.
Yeah.
We're going to have to end it in a moment. Any quick myths about beer that you can tell us about in 30 seconds?
Oh, quick myths. I would probably, we've kind of already talked about it, but the history of beer in St. Louis is much more than Anheuser-Busch. They play a big role, but this city has hundreds of breweries with wonderful stories to tell.
Well, your book is a wonderful book. It's a beautiful coffee table edition, and it's just great job on it, Cameron.
Thank you very much.
Cameron Collins, co-author of St. Louis Brews, The History of Brewing in the Gateway City. Podcast episodes of St. Louis on the Air are available at stlpublicradio.org, or you can subscribe for free on Apple Podcasts, the new Google Podcast app, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio 90.7 KWMU. Thank you for listening. I'm Don Marsh.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.